Thank you, Julie, and good morning, everyone. Of course, I was always a bit of a contrarian as an economist working for Unifor. What do you expect from a union economist? Some people consider that a contradiction in terms, I think. And living in Australia hasn't helped matters, because you're upside down all the time, the blood rushes to your head, I think. So my talk today, I'm going to run over what I would call 5 contrarian insights about the future of work. I am deeply worried about the future of work, both the quantity and the quality of work, but not exactly for the reasons that we often hear about. So perhaps that will plant some seeds for today's discussion. One of the great things about the PPF is it pulls in people from all constituencies, including the labor movement. And I want to put on my Unifor hat just for a moment and draws your attention to what I think is a great document my colleagues at Unifor put out called The Future of Work is Ours. There's a group of Unifor folks with a few copies over there. Please check out that document when you have a chance. There's my Twitter and our website down at the Center for Future Work. First, contrarian insight, work is not disappearing. In fact, work in the general sense cannot disappear. I think that a lot of the discussion about the disappearance of work caused by robots and automation comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how production actually occurs in the economy. The reality is that human labor, productive human labor, broadly defined as everything we do with our brains and brawn to transform materials that we harvest from nature, hopefully sustainably, into useful goods and services. That is the fundamental engine that drives our economy and that supports our standard of living. Automation, of course, is a different way of working, but it's still human labor. We just use more tools and technology and more indirect work rather than direct work. The reasons why work will not disappear, some of them I think are familiar to people who've been following the discussion. The reality is new technologies often create jobs as well as destroying them. They always create new jobs as well as destroying them, including the jobs associated with the technology itself and jobs in new industries that are opened up by the technology. And we can always manage the economy if we choose to in a way to ensure that there's enough work for people. Now, those aren't guarantees. It doesn't mean that we don't have to worry about the quantity of work, but those are countervailing factors. Less familiar reasons why I'm also convinced work is not disappearing. A chronic failure of business to invest in all of these new technologies and to accumulate capital and the capacity to do work more productively, and I'll show you that in a moment. The growing importance of care work in our overall portfolio of production and demand, work that is hard to automate, that uses hands-on techniques and should continue to use hands-on techniques, and the perpetual capacity of a competitive, deregulated labor market to create and recreate lousy jobs. You can pass someone on a street in downtown Toronto where there's supposedly a shortage of labor and supposedly a shortage of skills and see somebody being paid cash in hand to stand on a corner with a sign, okay? I can't imagine a less productive job in society and a job that's easier to automate. But when thousands or millions of people are desperate for work, any work, the labor market will put people into the most menial, unvaluable, poorly paid positions. And that's another reason why work isn't going to disappear. I think of it in 3 tiers, going from the general process of productive human labor or work to employment, which is a subset of work. As Heather just pointed out, much of the work that we do in society is not paid employment, but most of the work we do in the formal economy is. Then more specific still is a job. How do we organize the relationships in paid employment in terms of how you work, how you are paid, and who tells you what to do? And there's no doubt that technology is changing jobs, generally for the worse right now, but many other factors are impacting on jobs, including some that I'll talk about. But there's no possibility that work in a general sense can disappear. In fact, my second insight, there's no evidence at an economy-wide level that labor-saving or labor-replacing technology is actually accelerating at all. Now, we can see all kinds of incredible things happening in laboratories and demonstration projects about the amazing things that robots can do. This is the one, frankly, that scared the hell out of me. I don't know if you saw the one of the robot that can assemble an IKEA chair, okay? I will tell you that my spouse started looking at me differently after she saw this robot, wondering, why do I need that guy anyway? The reality is that there's incredible things that can be done in laboratory or controlled situations, and some industries and occupations are being strongly and rapidly affected by technological change. But at an economy-wide level, there's no evidence whatsoever that labor productivity growth, which is what automation has to deliver, is accelerating. In fact, there's more evidence that it's slowing, not that it's accelerating. And investment by employers is very weak in robots and technology. So this is a graph that shows the Canadian business sector's investment in machinery and equipment. And I know they invest in a lot of other things, including research and development and intangible capital, but it hasn't been growing either. And it has fallen by 1/3 as a share of our GDP since 2000, and there's no evidence that there's a big pickup. If, in fact, workers were being replaced with machines, this would not look like this. Incidentally, 2000 is when Canada began a great experiment, starting with Paul Martin at the federal level, in cutting business taxes in order to stimulate more investment in capital equipment and machinery and other assets, and it obviously hasn't worked. So if we want more investment, and I think we do, we have to find other ways to do it other than dangling an ever larger carrot in front of business. In terms of labor productivity growth, it's just chugging along in Canada at an unspectacular rate of 1% per year. Not the worst in the world, but obviously nothing to be proud about. And if, in fact, 47% of existing jobs were going to be automated, as the Frey and Osborne results and others have suggested, we would have to go from the blue spot to the red spot on this line very, very quickly. But in fact, we aren't. So it's going to take us a century at this rate to get to the Frey and Osborne results, and not a handful of years. And in my judgment, the problem is we're not investing enough in new technology and applying it in real jobs, and I would say that's largely a failure of business leadership in our economy. Another subject that gets all kinds of hype, of course, is the so-called gig economy and digital platforms and on-demand work that comes from it. My point is, there's nothing new about that. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt about 200 years ago, in fact. If we look at the common defining features of gig work, on-demand work, no commitment to ongoing engagement, paid on a piecework basis, the workers tasked with assuming responsibility for tools and capital equipment and the place of work, some kind of triangulated relationship between the person doing the labor, the end user of that labor, who could be a consumer or could be another business, and then the middle person or agent or taskmaster in the middle of it. Those are features that are as old as capitalism, frankly. We've seen them for ages. The new piece of it, the exciting new piece of it, is some kind of digital mediation of that process, but excuse me for not being excited. Everybody uses digital mediation in their work, and I don't think that is a fundamental shift. So here's one example of the historical antecedents of so-called gig work. The putting out system was the earliest form of manufacturing in Europe, and how it worked was a merchant capitalist, not an industrial capitalist, would purchase the raw materials, farm it out to people, usually women, who did the work in their own homes on equipment that they could perform, formed or manufactured clothing or shoes or small handicrafts, tools, took them back to the merchant, got paid, and then hoped for another gig. Okay? So that was the gig economy right there, 250 years ago. All we're missing is a smartphone, okay? So we'll give her a smartphone to organize the next gig and crucially get compensated, because today's power of the digital intermediary largely comes from controlling the flow of money. That's why you can't pay cash when you take an Uber. I hope you're not taking an Uber, but you can't pay cash if you made the morally indefensible decision to take an Uber. So I could set up this, I could create a .com. I'm sure there's an IPO involved here, Ed. I would call it puttingout.com, perhaps. Wait, no, that wouldn't be right, no. So looking at that history of gigs, what we now understand as the standard employment relationship, where you had a permanent job that lasted indefinitely for one employer on their place of work and got paid according to the day or the hour or the week or the year, was actually rare until after World War II. The rise of the standard employment relationship reflected many factors. Technology was one of them, but most of the factors driving it were social and political economic factors. The decline of the standard employment relationship more recently, so today, half of Canadian workers have a job with some dimension of precarity in it, either temporary or part-time or casual or labor hire positions, also reflects many features, not just or mostly technology, including the chronic state of excess supply in labor markets. You couldn't hire people to work for lousy wages at unpredictable hours, driving fast food around on a bicycle, okay, unless there was a pool of people out there who were desperate to do anything. And that is a crucial precondition for the rise of the gig economy, and it's not inevitable, and it's got nothing to do with technology. Same goes with the passivity of regulators and falling expectations among workers who then feel there's nothing else that they can do. And it worries me to see young people today growing up saying, I don't think my career will ever amount to anything more than a series of gigs. That's a horrible statement, not just on society, but what they think they can see from their lives. I also do not think that, given the technology change that's occurring, that our economy in a fundamental sense is actually held back by a skills shortage. I do not accept the hypothesis of a skills shortage. Our workforce, including young people, is better educated today than it's ever been and one of the best educated in the world. There are millions of Canadian workers employed today who don't remotely utilize the skills and capacities that they have and that they and society invested in. We also see a failure by business to invest in skills and human capital that matches their failure to invest in physical capital. And in fact, when you see the Statistics Canada reports on job vacancies, a very disproportionate share of them tend to be in retail and hospitality work, where it's got nothing to do with a shortage of skills. It's got everything to do with the failure of employers to offer attractive terms and conditions. So you have an industry marked by perpetually high turnover and therefore a given stockpile of vacancies at any point in time. Even employers who report on the various surveys that they can't attract the right people, that shift in itself is endogenous with the conditions of chronic excess labor supply that I mentioned. Employers have gotten used to the fact that there's far more workers out there looking for work than positions available and have increased their expectations about what they want to see in those applicants. And there's careful empirical work that's been done to show that when labor markets are indeed tight and we're close to full employment, suddenly employers have a willingness to actually take people who apply and then put some money and time into training them. The implications of that for skills strategy, I'm not saying we shouldn't invest in skills. We absolutely should and must continue to. I think vocational education in particular is very chaotic and underdeveloped in Canada. We could learn so much from the Germans and some of the other European countries as to how they invest in vocational education, value vocational education. They don't see it as a second chance or a fallback for people who couldn't get into university, and then match vocational graduates with actual decent work. I think we have to be very skeptical of employer claims of ongoing skills shortages and inability to attract the right people. If they were genuinely desperate, they would start putting some actual money on the table to do that. My final contrarian insight, I reject the thesis of technological determinism, that the challenges that we see in the world of work have to do with the onward march of technology, and it's inevitable. You can't stand in the way of progress. I remember the famous Canadian futurist who wrote, "You can't bet against Uber. Uber is the future." Well, lo and behold, if you look at their IPO, you can bet against Uber. And there's a lot of short sellers who've done exactly that. There's nothing inevitable or technologically determined. I'm still of the era where this is a Terminator reference for those old enough in the room to get it, where in fact the machines do not rule us. Humans rule the machines. The question is which humans are in charge and to what interests are the machines being directed. And I think the crucial challenge around the quality and quantity of work in the future is the shifting balance of power in our labor market and our society. The whole set of changes that we see, not just around skills and automation and gigs, but the general problems of precarious work, low job quality, and stagnant wages have everything to do with the shift in balance of power in our society and our economy over the last generation, and the general ability of employers today to extract more discipline, more labor effort, more obedience from workers for a lower cost, and to shift more and more of the risk and cost associated with the ups and downs of employment onto the backs of workers. And technology is one factor among many, and I would argue not the most important one. I want to see us put technology in its place in this discussion today. There will be lots of work to do in the future, and it's up to us as a society to decide how we're going to organize that work, how we're going to compensate it, how we're going to value and protect the people performing it. And there's an obvious short list of initiatives, including the need to support stronger labor demand conditions, and that will force employers to increase their effort in terms of the compensation and the opportunities and the skills opportunities that they are providing to their workers. Regulatory structures and active policies to support wages and lift them over time. Rights for workers, empowering workers to give them information and the capacity to bargain over technological change. And that way I think we can make a future for work that works for workers. So I'll start it off with that. Thank you very much for your interest and your attention.
You go to number 4, I go to number 3. And our water's in front of us. Thank you, Jim. So just to go back to the most important point you made about the robots and the IKEA thing. So first of all, do you know...
Do you assemble IKEA furniture?
Well,
Ed, tell me the truth.
I do, and I have 3 kids and a household full of IKEA stuff, but I always, the last piece always does go backwards. And so I just wonder in your case, isn't this exactly the good side, the upside of technology, in that now you can test the weight-bearing capacities of your back deck instead of being, doing
assembly.
Assembly, yeah.
Right. Yes, and it's not my comparative advantage, if I can invoke that.
Yeah. So it frees you up to be more productive.
Yeah, it could, as long as there was a guarantee that I'd have something more productive to do, and that is a reality in our labor market, where people are chronically insecure. And in fact, the general thrust of policy over the last generation has been to keep them insecure. This was a sort of founding principle of neoliberal labor market policy, was to get rid of this culture of entitlement, in the sense that you could show up to work and demand your rights, and replace it with a world where you show up to work and be thankful that you've got a job. And that has been an achievement in that perspective of how the labor market's been organized for the last generation. If we were to replace it with a world where, yes, you will get a job and you will be treated decently, I can assure you that 98% of the resistance to technological change and any other kind of innovation would disappear, because people would say, excellent.
Okay. Now, first off, I want to say hi, everybody. I'm Ed Greenspon, President of Public Policy Forum. I didn't identify myself, so that was bad. I was just so captivated by this idea of not having to do the IKEA furniture anymore. On Slido, if you have questions for Jim, feel free to ask away, and they will appear magically here on a screen that we will both, I think, be able to read. So Jim, you set it up as being contrarian, and contrarian it is. I just wonder, how do people in the organized labor world react when you tell them that technology historically has not produced long-lasting mass unemployment, and that when it does exist, it's usually for reasons other than technology, and that they're kind of perhaps looking at the wrong monster? What kind of reaction does that evoke?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ed. It can be a career-limiting move for the union economist to go to the union president and say, buddy, you're barking up the wrong tree here, okay? Maybe that has something to do with why I work in Australia
now. Exile to Australia.
No, not really. In my experience, union leaders and activists at the local and national level are hungry for information. I have argued hard with the union people to say, look, all of this fear about robots is misplaced. That, first of all, it isn't the key problem. It isn't the key reason that there isn't enough work around and the quality of work is under threat. And we've got better battles to fight. So I have given that advice, and I think to some extent it has been heard. And I do think that there's more caution now than there would have been, say, 5 years ago about all of these prognostications about the end of work. And after all, for people who are old enough, like I am, it's come and gone about 4 times, even in my adult life. The whole infatuation with the work is going to disappear, and our biggest problem is going to be too much leisure time. What are we going to do? We're going to be bored. And of course, it doesn't happen that way. And the reason it doesn't happen that way is because there's a power dynamic in the labor market that determines how much we work and what kind of work we do and what we get paid for it. My union, the CAW, and now Unifor, was a leader in the fight for shorter working time for years and years and years and years. And that's one way to transform productivity growth and technology into life, not just better incomes, but more time to enjoy it. But we have hit a brick wall in the last quarter century around trying to fight for shorter working time, and the employers that we deal with across the gamut have used their enhanced power to push back and not just stop further progress, but actually roll back some of the gains.
Grabbing the fruits of the productivity gains, you say? For
themselves, yes. There have been great productivity gains. An auto plant, even before the one in OSHA got shut down, was producing 3 times as many vehicles with a smaller workforce than one would have 25 years ago. And I don't think our union ever stood in the way of that. We never said, don't put robots on the assembly line. You know, we'd say we have to have rules about how the robots work. We have to have rules to protect the people who are still there in terms of the intensity and repetition of the work. And most of all, we have to have rules about how the gains are going to be shared, not by throwing people out on the street, but by reducing working time and lifting wages. That was our project.
So you mentioned OSHA. Let's talk about OSHA for a while, and we'll have a session this afternoon, kind of case study from 3 different perspectives on OSHA. So you have about 2,600 approximately hourly workers who won't be assembling vehicles in the way that they have assembled vehicles. There's a new side deal that will save a number of jobs, perpetuate them. But nonetheless, car assembly is gone in the way that it's occurred there for a century. Meanwhile, you have 1,000 engineers and PhDs in Markham and in Oshawa building autonomous vehicles, or I shouldn't say building autonomous vehicles, doing the research that will lead us toward autonomous vehicles. I mean, that seems very much a good metaphor for what's happening more generally in the economy. Doesn't that, when you sort of say technology won't have effects, but there's huge disruptions to probably the more repetitive end of the workforce.
Well, a couple things, Ed. First of all, I hate the word disruption, okay? If somebody comes along and takes the wallet out of my back pocket, okay, and runs away with it, I haven't been disrupted, okay? I've been robbed, okay? So that's my one point.
Okay, so they're being robbed of their jobs.
My second point is there's no connection between the software workers in Waterloo, you know, some of whom will work for GM, most of whom don't, most of whom are funded with public money. There's no connection between those jobs and shutting Oshawa. Okay, and the shutdown of Oshawa had nothing to do with the transformation of the auto industry to produce EVs. Those vehicles are still being made, they're still being sold in Canada. The difference is they're being made in Mexico instead of here. And the reason they're being made in Mexico is because we've given companies like GM the power to say, we're going to move these jobs wherever it's the most profitable for us. So that's the crucial structure of that whole decision. Now, we'll argue with GM about their decision and about how they're going to respond to that, but don't believe for a minute that there's a natural trend to take automation and take boring factory jobs and transform them into great engineering and computer programming jobs. Yes, Canada's got some great advantages in computer programming, and that's probably why GM and some other companies are putting some of the work there, but there's no guarantee they're going to do that. And as soon as Mexicans or Chinese or anyone else learn to do that work as effectively as Canada does, and that's not far away, by the way, for much cheaper, then the same pressures that led GM to take that work that still exists and put it in Mexico instead of here will affect those industries as well. So I'm all for trying to stimulate those high-end technology jobs, and I think we need active industry policy, or I would call it sector development policy now, to make sure that Canada has a strong share in that. It won't happen automatically. It won't happen because we're inherently smarter than other countries. It will happen because we put policy in place. That's how we got the aerospace industry. That's how we got the telecommunications industry, and that's how we'll get those industries in the future. So by all means do it, but don't see it as two sides of the coin. Right now it's two entirely separate decisions, and those engineering jobs which we want will not fall from the sky because the market gave them to us. They will come to Canada if we as a country say they need to come to Canada.
Okay, let's go to Slido questions. And there's one about the gig economy, and I had wanted to ask you about your historical continuity on gigs. But is there no scenario in which you see a new gig market supported by a new regime of worker rights to bargain? So I think this is a huge issue for people. One of our 5 initial papers that's not published yet looks at models of giving some bargaining power to gig workers. What do you see as how that might unfold over time?
Oh, there's an absolute scenario. I mean, there's a core of useful, actually productive technology at the center of some gig business models, okay? So the Uber app is, for some people, a somewhat more efficient way to hail a taxi, okay? That's the core productive benefit of that. The main feature of a gig business has nothing to do with that, because the productive process of driving someone in a rideshare vehicle is no different than in a taxi. It's an individual in a car who comes and picks you up, takes you from point A to point B. It's all about using the technology as an opportunity to transform the employment relationship in a way that's more profitable for Uber than for a traditional taxi company. So we can absolutely capture the kernel of productive usefulness in that app, but maintain the protections for the people who work there. There's nothing that says an Uber type of business has to have people who are artificially defined as contractors rather than employees, and thereby stripped of all their rights to minimum wage, health and safety protection, a pension at the end of their career, or anything else. You can absolutely combine them, and you should. But what we need is, first of all, regulators who get off their butts and say this is something we should be doing, right? Instead of going, oh, it's so exciting, look at the gig economy, which is frankly what they've done. Okay, and then we have to have the pressure on companies like Uber to say, yeah, if you've got a better way to hail a taxi, go for it. But you're still going to guarantee your employees, and they absolutely, for all practical purposes, are employees, a minimum wage.
So I don't expect you to agree with this, but to some extent, don't you think? So I am a customer of Uber's, as well as I'm.
Can I see your phone?
I'm fairly ecumenical in my taste.
I'm just going to quickly delete that app.
We'll I also do assemble. So, and I talk to people who work in, let's say, the entertainment industry.
Yes.
They don't work full time in the entertainment. Right. Instead of waiting tables, they're driving Uber. I talk to older folks who aren't having pensions as easily as they did defined benefit pensions, so they're doing this. I talk to high-altitude construction worker working at Yonge and Eglinton. Instead of spending 2.5 hours after shift driving to Caledon, where he lives, he spends an hour driving Uber until traffic dies down and makes a couple $100 a week. That doesn't seem like a bad thing. That's people, exercising some freedom of choice.
On one level, perhaps with the exception of the construction worker, you've just proved my point, that the gig model today depends on a pool of desperate people who will take any job, even a couple hours here and a couple hours there, because most of the examples, the retiree who doesn't have an adequate pension to live on, the entertainment worker who can't get enough work, is about that. Secondly, the entertainment industry is actually a good example because they've had gigs for a long time. In fact, that's where the word gig comes from, okay, for those of you who'd had a garage band in their youth, like I did, okay, in my youth. That's where gigs come from. And in fact, there's lots of precedents in the entertainment industry about how you can make gigs decent, fair positions. And it starts with unions, and it starts with regulations, and it starts with a relationship where employers understand, no, I can't just go out and hire so-and-so for the cheapest possible rate. I have rules to follow, and there's benefits to the rules, not just for the worker, but in terms of the safety and the quality of the service that's delivered. So, is there a situation where I can imagine people who work a few hours here and a few hours there and get treated decently? Absolutely. But it won't happen out of the goodness of Uber's heart or any other tech entrepreneur's heart. It will happen because we as society said, all of those things we fought for over the history of capitalism to provide workers with a certain basic expectation that they'll be treated fairly still apply. And just because I've got a smartphone doesn't mean all of that went out the window.
Right. Okay. So if you were going to pick those battles, to the top question there, what are the right battles to fight? Where do you focus your efforts in shifting the power dynamic? So if you had one or two spots to shift the, to one or two places to fight, where would that be?
It's hard to narrow it down to one or two. I would certainly start by looking at the practice of insecure or precarious work in society and how that has evolved and what limits we can place on it. Again, not to take away all flexibility from it. I'm not saying everyone has to work full-time 40 hours a week year-round, but there are ways in which the traditional protections and standards of the labor market could be adapted and modernized to fit a more flexible, free-ranging, and in some ways precarious labor market. The Ontario government, the previous Ontario government, made, I'd say, a gigantic and very productive initiative in that regard with their Changing Workplaces Review, where they pulled together people, I'm sure many of the people in this room were involved, to discuss how to modernize those regulations. And they had, I think, a very few important steps forward. Now we have a new government in Ontario who says all of that stuff is red tape and is out the window. So that progress and that initiative, I think, has been sacrificed, but I think the insights from it are valid, and that would still be, I'd say, a top priority. How do we modernize minimum wage laws, occupational health and safety, minimum expectations on training, and collective representation and union opportunities so that people in this, exciting, flexible world can actually win some of those protections?
Okay, Julia's ready to yank us off stage, but last question just before she does that, which is, you've spent the last several years in Australia.
Yes.
You've been working on the future of work issue. sometimes when people leave their country, I found this leaving Canada for 5 years, I saw it much more clearly. So what do you see of, what do you think more of Canada as you compare it to Australia, as you look at it from afar?
Yeah. I would say I'm more proud of Canada, having lived in Australia for a while. There's a lot of similarities between the two countries, but I would say that the sort of messy, muddled process of dialogue and discourse and policymaking that happens in Canada that we get frustrated with when we're in the middle of it actually provides for, I'd say, more careful, thoughtful, and inclusive policymaking than you see in most other places, including Australia. And I think it is one reason why workers in Canada have done better than in most other places, including Australia, at hanging on to and modernizing some of those benefits and protections that I talked about.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jim.
Cool. Thank you.